Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a new talk about sequels. In this case, sequels to Beethoven. Now, of course, Beethoven was a hugely influential composer, perhaps the most influential who ever lived, at least over the 19th century. So everybody who wrote orchestral music, particularly, or instrumental music, was probably influenced in one way or another by Beethoven. However, I have something very, very specific in mind, and this particular example touches on a lot of very, very interesting historical issues, one of which is near and dear to my heart, which is the influence of German music on Italian and vice versa, and the reception of German music in Italy and vice versa, because our assessment of music history is the result of a long, long period of 19th century political nationalism. And at that period, musicology, that is the writing of music history and the practice of music history and musicology, really got started. And it was the result of the political influences and prejudices characteristic of its time. And some of those are still with us. And one of those is the idea that German music and Italian music are somehow mutually incompatible, and that the Italians disdain German music and the Germans disdain Italian music and think it's trashy and unintellectual, and there was all this resentment back and forth because opera music itself, the language of music, was Italian, and the Germans were always playing catch-up, and it was just a whole concatenation of cultural prejudices. But of course, we need to keep in mind that in Beethoven's day, Germany did not exist. Of course, the German language did, German culture did, but politically, Germany did not exist. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a polyglot assemblage of a zillion different nationalities speaking a zillion different languages. Italy didn't exist. It was a pile of separate kingdoms, a lot of them under the control of Austria. And there's one of these that I think we need to talk about. And the one I'm thinking about is Bergamo, because Bergamo in 1815 became an Austrian crown territory, and there was a composer active in Bergamo since 1802 who I think is a case worth investigating in terms of the influence of Beethoven on further developments of Italian music and European music generally. The composer is Giovanni Simone Mayr. Now, Mayr's real name was Johann Simon Mayr. He was a German/Austrian/Austro-Hungarian composer. And he's known today, to the extent he's known at all, as the father of Italian opera. Why? First of all, he wrote a whole batch of them in a style that was quite different from the usual opera buffa of, say, Cimarosa and the composers of the 18th century. And second of all, he was the teacher of Donizetti. And that was a big deal because, as we all know, Donizetti and then Bellini, they were the founders of the Romantic bel canto school of Italian opera, from which all 19th century Italian opera arises. And Mayr was Donizetti's teacher. And Mayr was a huge admirer of Beethoven, believe it or not. And we know this. We know it not because of anything he specifically said, but because of the music that he wrote. And, he wound up in Bergamo in 1802, as I said, where he founded the conservatory there. His real ambition was to be a composer of liturgical music, of Catholic church music, and that's what he did for the most part. But he ran the entire musical life of the city, and the composers he trained were dispersed throughout Italy and other countries. His own music is very, very little known, but it's recently begun to be cataloged and released in critical editions, and quite happily, Naxos has been recording it, and quite well too. And this is a splendid series of recordings. There's probably almost a dozen of them now, or there's going to be shortly. And there's just tons and tons of music that this guy wrote. But what's fascinating about listening to this music is we begin to hear some sequels. And the sequels are absolutely fascinating. For example, here's a lovely disc of Mayr overtures. There you go. It's conducted by Franz Hauk with a couple different orchestras to put the collection together. And there are, let me see, a whole bunch of them, at least 11 overtures here, of which 9 of them are opera overtures. I mean, he was a very prolific composer, Mayr was. And one of those overtures is to an opera called Gli Americani, the Americans. The Americans in specific refers to the South Americans, and the Incas in Peru, if you want to be completely specific about it. And the plot of this opera is exactly what you might expect from a zillion soon-to-come romantic operas, including, Fernand Cortez and Lacme, and it's virtuous Western white guy goes to primitive, tribal, new exotic location, in this case Peru, falls in love with innocent virgin temple slave slash, priestess, whatever she is, princess, some personage of the female character, and they hook up, as it were, and the consequences are typically tragic. I mean, this particular topos, this plot line, would be consistently followed all the way into the 20th century. I mean, Puccini's Madame Butterfly is basically that story, isn't it? It's about the clash of cultures and the implied or overt superiority of Western culture to everything else. And that was the plot of Gli Americani. But the fascinating thing is that Mayr wrote an overture which starts with essentially the same gesture that opens the magic flute, slightly altered so as not to make the resemblance all that obvious. It doesn't work. It's hugely obvious. And then just when you're ready for the allegro to get started, this is what we hear. Now, you recognize that tune, right? It's the opening of Beethoven's Third Piano Concerto. I mean, it really is, not just in melody. Of course, Mayr is major, Beethoven is minor, but Beethoven turns it into the major in about 30 seconds. It's the same tune, almost identical scoring. After that, the pieces go their own way. I mean, one is an overture, one's a piano concerto. There's a difference. Mayr's is not in the sort of developmental frame that Beethoven is, shall we say. But goodness gracious, Mayr must have known it. And the interesting thing is that if Mayr was in contact with Beethoven and was familiar with Beethoven's music, this was in 1805. That he wrote Gli Americani, and it was first performed in 1806. But the fascinating thing about it is that Beethoven's Third Piano Concerto was premiered in 1803 and published in 1804. So Mayr must have been very, very current with German music and what was going on in Beethoven's world. Now, Gli Americani was quite popular. It was performed in and around Italy. And so Beethoven somehow got into the consciousness of listeners to Gli Americani. And later on, about 1820 or so, Mayr wrote another work, an absolutely delightful little concerto, which is called, on this particular disc, which is also conducted by Franz Hauk, the Concerto Bergamasco, because it has no other name. It's the concerto in D minor for flute, clarinet, basset horn, piccolo, and orchestra. It's an absolutely delightful piece. It's on this wonderful disc, where each movement features a different soloist, and they all play together in the finale one way or another. But it's perfectly charming. And as we're listening to the first movement, which is a first movement flute concerto, the soloist is the flute, we hear this second subject. Yes, your ears do not deceive you. Mayr basically lifted it from the second subject of Beethoven's Second Symphony in D major. And there it is. I mean, he had no problem borrowing these things. This leads us to an interesting question, because obviously Mayr's use of these tunes, and that's what they are, is purely opportunistic and totally thematic. In other words, he's not trying to develop them in the way Beethoven did. He's not trying to refer to Beethoven overtly. The question is, what was he doing? I mean, he was perfectly capable of coming up with his own tunes, obviously. And the intent, is it to introduce Beethoven to the audiences in Bergamo? Is it to somehow water down Beethoven? That is, to present him in a way that sugars the pill for Italian audiences who might be less sophisticated or less interested in the German style of composition, and so it needs to be kind of, gussied up and presented in a different form for those audiences? We have no idea. We don't know what his intention was. But the fact that this is obviously Beethoven, and Mayr had to know it was obviously Beethoven and was presenting it to his audiences in Bergamo, is really a fascinating sequel to Beethoven's own oeuvre at the time, because this is just at the time that Beethoven was entering his late period. And then we come to our last and perhaps most wonderful example of all, and this is a very famous work of Beethoven, which Mayr turns into an accompanied recitative in a cantata, believe it or not. Here, listen to this. Okay, so there it is, Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. Now, this particular example, I'm going to get it out for you, has a lot more logic than most of the others, I have to confess, because the piece in question, and it's only 15 minutes long, is the cantata on the death of Beethoven. Now, Mayr wrote this cantata on the death of Beethoven in 1827, so it's right there. I mean, the corpse wasn't even coal in the ground when this cantata showed up. Mayr was able to do it quickly because apparently this is the same cantata as his cantata on the death of Haydn. Only all you have to do is switch around the music that you steal for the accompanied recitatives about how wonderful the deceased was, and you can plug in whatever music you want to plug in. So now he's plugging in Beethoven in his funeral cantata. But the fact that he wrote a funeral cantata to play in Bergamo on Beethoven's death says something about how revered the name of Beethoven was, even in Italy at this time, at least in Mayr's conservatory and in the musical life of the town. But even more interestingly, I think, are the works that he quotes in his funeral cantata, because the Pastoral Symphony is the only symphony that makes it into the list. The others are Christ on the Mount of Olives, the Mass in C, and Wellington's Victory. In other words, pieces of music that nobody cares about today. I mean, the least of Beethoven's major works are the ones that Mayr was holding out to his fellow musicians and music lovers as, evidence of Beethoven's eternal genius, which tells us, of course, first of all, that his priorities were not the same as our priorities, which isn't surprising, and also that Beethoven was being promoted as a composer of, first of all, patriotic pot boilers, and second of all, liturgical music, of all things. Of course, he does not quote the Missa Solemnis, but, the point remains. I mean, his interest was liturgical music, and so that's an aspect of Beethoven that he chooses to present. Again, is this to make Beethoven more acceptable? I mean, the Pastoral Symphony, too. It's programmatic, right? It's illustrative music. Is this something he does specifically for the Italian audience? It's got to be vocal music or program music in some way that represents Beethoven's genius at his best? Again, we don't know. But the evidence is incredibly suggestive and extremely interesting. I mean, let's face it, this is fascinating stuff. And we know that somehow Beethoven's music, in the days before recordings, in the days before there was an international market for music, it got out there. It spread around. People heard it. Maybe some of them didn't realize they were hearing it, but it was disseminated, and it was disseminated in all kinds of non-traditional, by our standards, non-traditional ways. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to this series of sequels, and I do hope you'll explore some of the many discs of Mayr's music on Naxos. Not because they all quote from Beethoven. They don't. Mayr had plenty of originality of his own, but because it's a wonderful niche of unexplored music that really deserves your attention. It makes you keep on listening, which is why we do this, correct? So thank you so much for listening to this video and watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Take care.